Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. The topic I was asked to talk about was lessons for planners coming out of COVID-19, and I think there's a lot. Just by way of background, I'm a 2000 graduate of the CRP program. I got my master's there, and then I went straight to law school and went to private practice for a number of years before I came into public service. And I see some of our city planners and council staff on there, so a little shout out to all of you guys. So I've got, maybe 5 lessons that I'll try to hit really quickly, and then happy to take questions. The first one is sort of the best laid plans of mice and men sometimes go astray. We have a hazard mitigation plan for the city. There's always one in place, and I'd be happy to share links to all this stuff afterwards. The hazard mitigation plan is sort of a standard document that comes out of the FEMA world. Ours, for example, is a joint effort between the City of Albuquerque, the county, Tijeras, AMAFCA, all of these different organizations in the region. And it really focuses on the hazards with the highest potential for damage to people and property. So in the last HMP, what our city and regional partners identified as the top hazards were flood, fire, drought, earthquakes, severe winter storms, tornadoes, dam failure, extreme heat, all very legit hazards, but what you did not hear there was pandemic. And we did drill for pandemics actually maybe 18 months before COVID hit, but it was also a different kind of pandemic. We were drilling for like anthrax, as opposed to a communicable disease that would potentially affect everybody in the city. So COVID was just very different, and we had to learn to sort of very quickly put aside our plans, figure out what still worked, which was fairly nothing, and start over again. So as planners, I think we know this, right? Like, you just have to be flexible. But some of the things that were in this crisis that weren't in any of the hazard mitigation plans were things like physical distancing. So even in our emergency operations center, it looks like, ever since the 80s, if you're as old as me, you saw the movie War Games. It's like a big bunch of tables with landlines and phones and people sitting really close to each other and putting on like vests and being in emergency mode. None of that worked for this era of social distancing. None of our mitigation plans had things like long-term daycare for everybody in the city or non-congregate shelter. So it's flexible because you can make the best hazard mitigation plan in the world and not necessarily hit the hazard that hits you. Second was our philosophy at the Emergency Ops Center has always been to look at everything through the lens of the most vulnerable people in our community, and that was absolutely essential during COVID. It really, this epidemic put a magnifying glass on every problem in our society. So just to give you some examples, we have now jointly operated with APS and the county. There are over 100 meal sites. We've given out over 200,000 meals to seniors, and combined with APS and county and everybody else in the region, over 600,000 meals in the past few months. We've done over 4,000 senior welfare checks. People are just vulnerable. People are made much more vulnerable by any hazard, and especially one like this. So by always centering those communities, I think we were pretty efficient in our response. We had to stand up a non-congregate shelter facility, which just means a place where people can isolate and not be in a big room with a bunch of other people. We've already had over 460 people come through that system, either because they were COVID positive, they were awaiting testing, and they just didn't have anywhere else to go. And we stood that up maybe in the first 2 weeks of the pandemic, recognizing with the state that was going to be a need. And we were so thankful that we had again come from that place of looking through the lens of the most vulnerable. So we've really needed that system. Third is remember that there are other things besides the emergency going on in the world. And that was just super important for this one, because it's really easy to sort of get focused on what's going on and what's like rapidly emerging. And it's also just kind of easier to just shut it down, just shut everything down. And I think all of the governments in our area have done a really good job of saying, okay, but what can we keep open? Because what are the other things that are still happening? So An example was, the economy, just we knew it was going to take a huge blow. And when we looked at all the sectors that we thought could still operate during the pandemic, one was construction. So we said, you know what, we just got to figure out a way to keep open planning, environmental health, fire marshal, these agencies that regulate the construction industry so that we can keep that part of the economy moving through the pandemic. And it was a lot of work to get everyone remote and remotely dispatched and all that stuff, but it was definitely worth it. I think in retrospect, it was the right approach. But you just gotta, as always, remember to keep zooming out and looking at the bigger world instead of just the pandemic and its immediate needs, because that could take all 24 hours every day. And fourth was just help. And I know that sounds kind of obvious, but I think it's really easy in government to get into a technocratic place of not being able to do things and all the constraints on what we can do. And it is just important to always ask the question, okay, get it, there's lots of things we can't do, but what can we do? An example of that was our food boxes program. So we have a great boxes of food program that comes out of our health and social services centers. And it has some minimal ID requirements that are tied to the USDA funding. And early on, we started getting calls about certain people couldn't meet those requirements but needed the box foods, and got a little bit stuck in the bureaucracy of like, well, we have to do that paperwork because that's where the funding came from. And we said, just forget it. We just need more boxes and more food. Let's take more donations, make sure that donated food isn't going through the hoops of federal funds. Let's just put some general fund money in there. Let's get some unrestricted dollars flowing to this program. Let's just help. And then we can figure it out later. And we did. So I think as planners too, people come to us with the technocratic side, and they like want to know what the obstacles are. So it's sometimes important for us to present those obstacles, but also the alternatives for getting past the obstacles. And then finally, I would just say, take your shot. There is always an opportunity to do things differently that comes in a crisis that goes away when the crisis is over. So we've tried to say, if there are things we always wanted to try and they make more sense during the pandemic, let's try them. One of them is in our emergency paramedic world. We've always wanted to have a telemedicine option. We've always thought that made sense. It's a better use of resources. It's better care for a lot of people. We've never been able to sort of get our act together to do that and to coordinate in the health service system. But there's been a tremendously amazing degree of cooperation in the whole health services system and that nobody has ever seen before. And that has enabled us to do some telemedicine from the field. We use our paramedic units. And that's something that would have probably taken 3 years of planning to ever get going, but we got it going in 2 months. So my final suggestion is just to take your shot. And if there's things you've always wanted to try and they become more practical in a crisis, just to use that as your opportunity to do some testing. I am seeing that there's some stuff in the chat, and I don't know if I should address that or if I should wait for the moderator. So I'll just wait for now and you can tell me what to do. Thank you.
I think that we have some time now if you want to answer. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Nair. That was really interesting and helpful. I really appreciate it. And it's your call. Do you want to take them now or do you want to do it at the end?
Do I still have time? I can take some just now. They're pretty quick.
You have time. We're at about 8. You're at 9 minutes. You're good.
Okay, great. So the first question from Sharon Housum was, FEMA hazard mitigation plans encompass natural hazards. Do you have any insights into whether their definition of the natural hazard will start to include pandemics and public health emergencies? My answer to that is yes. I'm not entirely sure that they didn't already because the definition of natural hazard, I think, does include biological hazards. But I do think the way that we center biological hazards in future FEMA plans is going to change. We should actually be in that planning process right now for the HMP. I'm kind of glad that we're not, and we'll get a little bit through this pandemic before we do that because we've learned so much. And then from Jim Strozier, hi Jim, what techniques have you used to ensure that all of the agencies are working together to address these issues? Oftentimes we hear concerns that each agency or government just wants to do their own thing. and cooperation is difficult. What lessons learned can you share about this? Great question. I have found that this has been, like I said, it's just been an unprecedented time of cooperation. People have gotten their stuff together to work together. I really, it wasn't easy. It was in some cases very hard. In some cases there were technological barriers to pooling our inventory of supplies, for example. But I do want to say that at least in New Mexico, and especially in central New Mexico, people have worked their butts off to coordinate. And for example, in that non-congregate shelter system, for each individual who comes into the system, there's a multi-agency response, and there are doctors, and there are social workers, and there's people who are on logistics, and we say, okay, this person needs to come into our system. What does he or she need? What do they need in terms of medical care? What do they need in terms of social services? Are they going to need food? Are they going to need clothes? We get them into that system with all those wraparound services around them when they land. And we'd love to do that for every single person in our community. I mean, isn't that kind of the dream? But the fact that we were able to do it for the 460 people who have come through this system so far, I think is a great example of how really it was just the pandemic itself was sort of the technique for addressing those interagency issues. There just wasn't time or space to be territorial or in a silo. So that was all the questions. Thanks.
Thank you. That was fabulous. And I think, Professor Martinez, I think you're next.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks. So thank you, Sarita. That was fantastic and inspiring. So I want to start by telling you, right, I'm a lawyer, not a planner, so I will be speaking as a lawyer today. But one of the things that I focus on a lot, I'm so sorry, excuse me, is housing. It's a basic human need, and in my experience, so much flows from it in terms of health, education, employment, other sorts of stability. And there are several elements of housing that I think are important to focus on, or to make sure that to try to support affordability, safety, right, good housing condition, and stability, right, being able to stay in the same place and determine when and where you are going to be moving. That's always important. It's crucial now to have those sorts of elements, but it's extra important now, extra crucial, if there's such a thing, given the public health emergency that we're going through, given the other societal effects of what we're seeing. And many of those things, stability and affordability, I know are important to planners as well. So we're all on the same page, I think. But evictions sort of throw a wrench into those works, even in the best of times, right? Especially when it comes to stability. Evictions are obviously a destabilizing event in people's lives. And for systemic and historical reasons, in this country, evictions, which affect primarily renters who are low income, right, that pool usually is disproportionately people of color and women, right? And women of color are the especially hardest hit in the eviction world. And in New Mexico, that's true, possibly more so than even in other places. The latest data that someone has collected, it was for 2016, about 1 in every 21 households was faced eviction in that year in Albuquerque. And that I have no reason to think that that has changed significantly until recently. But so, and as I mentioned, right, those were disproportionately folks who are going to be poor, folks who just can't afford to pay the rent. Most evictions in New Mexico do result from just non-payment, inability to pay the rent. And we have a system here that's not atypical in the United States, where if someone is a few days late with their rent, the landlord can very quickly file a lawsuit and get the court to order them to be evicted. And then at some point in the very near future after that, if the person hasn't left, the sheriff will come, and forcibly remove folks from their home, which is obviously a very serious displacement event. And it's a speedy process that can happen. I mean, it's sometimes dizzying in the speed with which it happens. And then, what happens to people? They move into worse housing typically. If you get an eviction, it can negatively affect your eligibility for certain types of housing subsidies. So you couldn't pay the rent before, now you extra can't pay the rent if you're in that situation. You have to find a new place. Often it leads to kids having to move to a new school, which has its own destabilizing and negative effect on educational and attainment, new routines. And it's a loss for the community as well, right? There's a loss of community ties, a loss of community identity, a loss of community stability if folks are getting evicted. So it's a nightmare for a low-income renter to be evicted, and in many neighborhoods around the country and even here in town, right? A constantly present destabilizing force that has historically moved very quickly. So that was the lay of the land back in early March, and then the pandemic hit, and folks, there was a lot of attention suddenly paid to, oh my goodness, we don't want to have everybody getting evicted while everyone's losing their jobs, while we're trying to make sure that people stay home and don't spread the coronavirus, right? During a public health emergency, we want to if you order people to stay at home, it's important for them to have a home to stay in. So there have been some movement and some recognition about the importance of this, but it's not permanent and is set to stop relatively soon. The federal government did what's called the CARES Act, which basically, you've probably heard of it, right? They pumped lots and lots of money into the economy through stimulus payments and other efforts, and money to different municipalities. And they also included in that a prohibition or a moratorium on eviction for non-payment from a lot of federally subsidized properties and of folks who are receiving federal housing subsidies. So there's a recognition that, yes, we don't want to be evicting people in this moment. That subsidy, or that moratorium, is set to expire at the end of this month. And so folks who have had that protection will no longer be benefiting from that starting July 25th, 26th. And that effectively extended to the end of August for technical reasons. New Mexico, what we did was the Supreme Court at the end of March handed down a moratorium on enforcing evictions. So you can still get evicted in New Mexico, literally, but you can't be physically evicted from your property right now. So if I can't pay my rent, my landlord has the option to file a lawsuit, take me to court, tell the court I want this person evicted. The judge will follow the law and, where appropriate, order the person evicted for non-payment. But we'll tell the sheriff, but you can't go physically remove these people just yet. We're waiting for further instruction from the New Mexico Supreme Court. They haven't given us any indication of when that will be lifted. But the effect is that folks are not physically being evicted, but they're still getting evictions on their record, right? That are still going to come into place and be effective as soon as the Supreme Court lifts this moratorium. Several of the financial supports that have been out there for folks have helped them to pay the rent, the increase in unemployment insurance and federal stimulus money. So as a result, what I have seen in the courts I look at has been a huge drop-off actually in the number of cases that are filed. The moratoriums and the supports have possibly been have resulted, or there's a connection anyway between these protections, these new regs, and a huge drop-off in the number of evictions, which is great from my standpoint, right? Is people aren't being dislocated and displaced in this moment. But these are just temporary. Right now, everyone who's looking at this is predicting a huge number of evictions as soon as the federal moratorium gets lifted, as soon as the stimulus, rather the unemployment insurance bump goes away, as soon as the state of New Mexico, the state Supreme Court decides to lift its eviction moratorium. And as more people are, so I expect a return, not just a return to the old levels, right, historical levels, but more people are going to be in financial trouble. I anticipate even more than usual number of folks going through the courts. And as I mentioned before, right, I expect these folks to disproportionately be from communities of color and women of color, but the effects of the pandemic are so widespread that we may see folks who we would not have normally been seeing in the eviction court, facing eviction as well. So I was thinking about what Sarita mentioned, right? This is a chance to try something new. And what I have been encouraged by is hearing folks a new attention and a new understanding of the role that stable housing can play in should play in people's lives, and does play in public health and community health, and all of the ways that having stable housing can be beneficial to our society. And this may be the time when folks start to recognize that it is recognize housing as a human right, and allocate resources and legislation accordingly. It makes sense to me, right? It's probably much less expensive to provide support for housing stability than to deal with the costs of eviction and dislocation, and cheaper to keep folks from getting evicted in the first place. And there's been some efforts to address what's going to happen in the medium term. There was a legislative effort up at the special session here a couple weeks ago to pause evictions for an extended period of time, and also create incentives for landlords and tenants to work stuff out, and create a lot of, a source of funding for rental assistance. That didn't have the legs we hoped it would. And so now it's really in the hands of municipalities to figure out, can we allocate resources, and how do we do that for rental assistance? There's been some work at the federal level as well. The House passed something called the HEROES Act that would have stopped evictions, paused evictions for I think 12 months. Not rent, just the actual getting evicted, to give everybody a chance to work things out. And there've been some other similar movements around the country, but by and large, there's not a lot going on, and it's, to me, becoming a source of concern as to what are we going to see in the next couple months, the next 6 months, around evictions and community stability. All right, that's it for me.
Thank you, Serge. That was excellent. And our next guest is Professor Rob Schwartz. I just got a message from the Professional Development Officer, James Fody, that he has created a web form for the evaluation, which I have been trying to share with everyone, but my chat is disabled. So if I can post that, I will. Otherwise, I'll put it up at the end as part of the presentation. Thank you. Professor Schwartz, are you ready to present?
Ready to go. Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Rachel and Aaron, for your extraordinary planning work and putting this panel together. And my thanks to Sarita and Serge for what I just heard and what I just learned. And I'm sure I'll learn an awful lot from Lani as well. I want to speak briefly on two issues, a macro issue and a micro issue. And both are in regard to planning in healthcare. Related to coronavirus, but more generally dealing with planning in healthcare, because we are now in the midst of one of the great planning disasters of the last century, which is the coronavirus pandemic. And I think that lack of planning is one of the primary reasons that all of us watching this discussion, are living in one of the most dangerous countries to live in, one of the most dangerous developed countries to live in during this pandemic. We're fortunately living in a comparatively safe state, but nonetheless, we face a coronavirus burden that is more significant than that is faced in people in most other developed countries. And we have to ask how we got there and whether the problem is planning with regard to coronavirus. Can we really expect planners to have anticipated the coronavirus? Well, yes, I think the answer is we can. That's one of the reasons we do planning. But the problem is not just the failure to plan for coronavirus. The problem now is the failure to plan for a pandemic more generally. And we can see how we got to where we are. The federal planning, mainly through the CDC, has been largely dismantled over the last 3 years. Planning for this kind of an event has been dismantled. Planning has been at least minimized in other departments of the federal government. That left this issue for the states, which have been, in New Mexico, for example, during the last several years, until a couple of years ago, we had a state legislature appropriating money for almost nothing, and we did not substantially increase the planning ability of our state Department of Health. That was true, I think, around the country. And really, it wasn't just a matter of failure to plan for coronavirus, it's the failure to plan for a pandemic. But it's not just the failure to plan for a pandemic, it's the failure to do public health planning more generally. And again, the federal system we know has been starved, and the state system we know has been limited. We can't plan for public health the way we haven't been planning for public health the way we did in the 1950s and 1960s and before that. But it's not just the failure to deal with planning for public health issues that's the problem either. It's the failure to plan as a failure of planning within healthcare systems that is a big part of this problem. In fact, it may be the heart of the problem. And you think about how we do planning for healthcare systems. I mean, we do not have enough doctors in this country or in this state. We do not have enough nurses. We do not have enough techs. What happened? How did we reach that point? How come we at the University of New Mexico are not training more physicians? How come we're not training more nurses? What could we do to be able to train more doctors and nurses? Because there are substantial limitations on what we can do. Have we not, in fact, been planning for what we knew would be coming? And in fact, you ask how we do planning in healthcare, the healthcare system, how we do systemic healthcare planning. And the answer is we do almost none of it formally. We leave it to healthcare corporations, to healthcare systems, to hospital corporations, to insurance companies, to professional corporations, to pharmaceutical manufacturers, to pharmaceutical benefits managers, to others in the healthcare industry to coordinate the system. And each one of them is fighting to maximize their own profit in this system. And that's what we have substituted for healthcare planning, for what in other countries would be real healthcare planning. And I think we can say that it hasn't worked. We do not have a well-planned healthcare system. But the problem is not just a failure to do healthcare systemic planning, it's a failure to do health planning. And as many of you know, probably all of you know, the healthcare system has comparatively little effect on the actual health of the population. But we fail to do planning in other areas as well. With regard to factors that do affect health in a fundamental way. For example, the environment, with regard to air, with regard to water. We've failed to do adequate planning with regard to housing generally. We failed to do adequate planning with regard to education, with regard to transportation, and in other areas as well that have a direct effect on health. So that failure to do planning with regard to health more generally has come to hurt us, but it's not just the failure to do planning with regard to health that has put us in the terrible position we're now in. It really is a failure to plan ahead with regard to the creation of an equitable society. And again, this is something that Serge focused on just a moment ago, and I won't go into it in detail in this particular panel because there'll be another time when we'll be able to discuss this issue. And you probably have been discussing this issue over the last month or so, But we can look and we can see that the failure to plan to have an equitable society has caused us, I would suggest, the failure to plan a society that fosters good health, that has pushed us to failure to the point where we have failed to plan a good healthcare system. And that has led us to failure to our position where we failed to plan on issues of public health. And when we fail to plan on issues of public health, we know we're going to fail to plan on with regard to pandemics. And when we fail to plan on pandemics, of course, we failed when it came to the coronavirus. So that's the sad news I have to deliver today, although I'm sure none of you are surprised to hear that. And any of you who've had any contact with the healthcare system know that, in fact, there are several layers of planning failure when it comes to healthcare. But nonetheless, here we are. And as Sarita said, we should be thinking about what we can learn under these circumstances. And we have learned something under these circumstances. And I wanted to focus for a moment on a micro issue where we actually have taken planning a bit more seriously. It's not maybe as important, but we have taken it as seriously. We're in the middle of the pandemic. It suddenly dawned on people across the country that we might run out of ventilators. We might run out of intensive care unit rooms. Later, that we might run out of therapeutic treatments, remdesivir, for example. We now realize that we may run out of vaccines when they come around too. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with scarce resources? What happens if two coronavirus patients or two patients who may or may not be suffering from coronavirus need a ventilator and only one is available? Who ought to get that ventilator? That shouldn't be decided by the bedside decision-making of a healthcare provider or anyone else at the last moment. We should plan ahead to make sure that there is an equitable distribution of those resources. And in fact, in this case, New Mexico and really every place in the country has planned ahead and has figured out how to deal with this, or at least has developed ways of dealing with it. And in New Mexico, as in many other states, there have been the creation of committees. In this case, it's the Ethics Committee of the New Mexico Medical Advisory Team. The Medical Advisory Team was created to deal with the question of how our healthcare system could approach coronavirus. The Ethics Committee was asked to make a recommendation about how to deal with scarce resources. And the Ethics Committee included four people: a lawyer, bioethicist, the head of palliative care at Presbyterian, the head of the Ethics Committee at UNMH, and a healthcare systems analyst who's also a cancer advocate and a consultant on tribal health. And so those four sat down and asked, what are the factors that we ought to consider in developing a policy on who gets scarce resources? And the thought was that that policy should be transparent, it should be absolutely open, it should be fair and recognized as fair by those who are affected by it, and it should be consistent, meaning that it should render the same answers across the state. Somebody in Tucumcari, someone in Albuquerque, someone in Gallup should be treated in the same way, and everyone should have the same access to those resources. And in New Mexico, there is a proposed set of crisis standards of care that would actually apply in the case of a shortage of any of these resources. And let me just tell you what the final outcome of the weeks of discussion on this issue turned out to be, and you can consider whether you think New Mexico did it right or whether you'd rather follow the directions that many other states have taken. In New Mexico, there was a thought first that we want to apply a utilitarian principle, but in a very limited way. It doesn't make any sense to allow someone a ventilator, for example, if that person is absolutely certain to die in the hospital anyway. So you want to make sure someone is going to be able to survive to be discharged from the hospital. But among all those people who would be discharged from the hospital, the New Mexico group thought that the selection should be done randomly. That is, by lottery. And then here's where New Mexico differed from much of the rest of the country. In other communities, and in most of the country, these were community-wide groups rather than statewide groups. But in most of the rest of the country, there were exceptions that provided a more utilitarian analysis. For example, in some places, those who had the longest life expectancy would be given priority. Those who had dependents, for example, would be given priority. Those who were healthier would be given priority. And in New Mexico, those were rejected in part because we thought that if you took, for example, those people with a longer life expectancy, those people who are going to live for 10 years, who probably would live for 10 years after their discharge, and advantage them over those who would live for 3 or 4 years, you end up giving substantial advantages to those who've always had access to the healthcare system because they're the ones who are going to be the healthiest. And we know that that access to the healthcare system is not equitable, that in fact, that makes a distinction based on primarily on resources, on wealth, but also on race and ethnicity, because some are deprived for a host of different reasons to access to the healthcare system, and that the only fair way to avoid that was to treat all of those who would benefit, all those who could be discharged from the hospital in just the same way. There was also a thought that giving an advantage to those with a longer life expectancy disadvantaged the elderly, who of course are going to have, as a general matter, a shorter life expectancy than those who are younger. There was a thought to reject, for example, the principle that said that those with dependents would get priority because there was a sense that that was a lifestyle choice that individuals had made, and that as a state, we shouldn't be favoring or disfavoring those choices. Your life shouldn't depend upon whether you decided to have children at some point. And that was unfair for those people who were, in fact, sick and in the hospital and needed this care. The conclusion ultimately was a straight lottery among those who could survive the hospital. Was it a good idea? I don't know. Whether you could probably help us in determining whether it was a good idea. I think we probably got it right on the micro issue. I hope that gives us hope for getting it right on the macro issue.
Thank you, Professor Schwartz. I'm a little distracted, but I think maybe one macro issue that you forgot to tell everyone is that you're on that committee. So thank you so much for all of your work on this, and thanks for the presentation. Lani, I've given you the PowerPoint sharing options, so I hope that works, and if it doesn't, we'll try and get that up.
Okay, I think I'm sharing my screen and I'm going to start my PowerPoint now. Let's see. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Yate she Lani Tsinnajinnie and Shia Filipino Nishna Tachini Bashistream Filipino Dashache Tsinnajinnie Dashanella. Good afternoon, everyone. As I introduced myself earlier, my name is Lani Tsinnajinnie. I'm an assistant professor in the Community and Regional Planning Department at UNM. And today I'll be talking about COVID-19 relief efforts in some Eastern Navajo communities, and also some water issues in our communities that have been heightened during the coronavirus pandemic. So thank you all for joining me this afternoon, and thank you Rachel and Erin for putting this panel together and for inviting me to present. So as mentioned before, I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation, which is one of 24 tribal nations with relationship to the state of New Mexico. My home community of Torreon, or Natnalgene, as we call it, is located on the far eastern part of the Navajo Nation political boundaries in what is known as a checkerboard area of the reservation because of the multiple jurisdictions that control land in that area. You can get to Torreon by Highway 197 via the US 550 highway, and there are a couple turnoffs near Cuba, New Mexico that you can get. Highway 197 runs from Cuba to Crown Point, is on the main and is the main paved road that runs through our community. The photo on the bottom right shows Highway 197 next to the Torreon Wash, which is a tributary of the Rio Puerco, and it takes about an hour, or between an hour and an hour and a half, to drive from Torreon to Albuquerque and Rio Rancho. The photo on the top right is a picture of me with my dad and older brother and older sister, and all three of us have all been able to go to or have attended UNM at some point. And I think this is because the relative closeness of the urban areas of Torreon to urban areas in New Mexico compared to other Navajo communities has afforded me and my brother and sister and other community members a lot of opportunities. A lot of our community members are also able to have jobs or attend UNM or CNM while continuing to live or maintain connections to our community. This convenience has helped to foster a lot of strong leaders from Torreon. So in 2003, several community leaders and advocates founded the Torreon Community Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization with the mission to empower Tsinnajinnie through various initiatives centering around the creation of vibrant, healthy community. And I have served on the board of the Torreon Community Alliance, or TCA, since 2018. Our board consists of Mario Atencio, who is our executive director, and he is also the legislative assistant to our council delegate, Daniel So, who is also on the board. And our board is made up of all Navajo members and from the Torreon community, including other community organizing leaders. Some previous projects of TCA before the pandemic began included providing scholarships, funding for Wi-Fi at our community library, youth watershed restoration internships, and also helping to host community forums to discuss potential impacts of oil and gas development in our region. Once the pandemic hit, though, through the leadership of Mario Atencio and support by Council Delegate Daniel So, TCA was able to quickly organize a relief effort for the far eastern Navajo communities represented by Daniel So. So the mission of our relief efforts are to supplement, but not really take the place of relief efforts organized by the respective chapters who serve the communities. For those who don't know, chapters are local Navajo subdivisions or Navajo government subdivisions. But because of TCA's status as a nonprofit, we're positioned to provide more immediate relief to communities without our funding or any kind of hold up through logistics, where relief efforts other relief efforts sponsored by chapters or the Navajo Nation government or other governmental agencies would have to go through. So we created a GoFundMe page. We also received several grants and private donations, and we're serving as the fiscal sponsor for what we termed the Far Eastern Navajo COVID-19 relief. And we partnered with the local county fire departments. The picture on the bottom left shows the Torreon substation for the Sandoval County Fire Department. And we partnered with these fire departments because they were essential employees. They're trained in properly using PPE, and because of that, it reduced the risk of having to train volunteers or taking volunteers out or sending volunteers out into the community. So our immediate relief focused on providing food boxes to our community members. And these food boxes included sacks of bluebird flour, beans, and other other types of food like Spam and also some fresh produce that was also donated by other mutual aid groups like the larger Navajo Hopi COVID Relief. let's see. And so this was like the focus of our main effort. We distributed over 500 food boxes, but as like around May, like mid-May came along, Mario and Daniel so began receiving word that our community members like were no longer in immediate need of food. And so we began to focus our efforts in other types of relief. And so Mario, he partnered with the state representative, Derek Lente, who was able to provide bales of hay for us at a discounted price. And so we bought several bales of hay, and those were distributed to those were picked up by several like community representatives in our area and distributed to community members who needed it for their livestock. And as the pandemic like became on and more relief effort was organized through local agencies and local chapters, and they were able to get more relief provided to our community, we started to think a little at the bigger picture items in ways that we can contribute and fill gaps to the relief effort. And one of these was also looking at ways we could provide scholarships or mobile hotspots to students who need it to or attend summer classes or looking towards the fall semester as it began, providing these Wi-Fi hotspots for our community or for our students in our community. However, one of the biggest needs that was identified was the need for water infrastructure in our community. So during the COVID-19, like the lack of infrastructure for water, it's been heightened, but it is not a new issue for our community. The Navajo Nation Water Resources Office, they estimate that 30 to 40% of homes in the Navajo Nation do not have plumbing. And in my home community of Torreon, this number is close to 50%. And this lack of infrastructure for running water in our communities has various costs. So the economic cost includes, or the tribe estimates that it costs $120 per 1,000 gallons for a family to haul water. And in comparison, for communities that do have running water, it only costs around $1 to $2 per $1,000. So this cost includes the gas, the transportation, the water barrels, and everything that's needed to haul water. And this is like, you know, there's a big focus on water issues, especially during that COVID-19, because water, of course, is needed for sanitation reasons, to wash our hands. It's difficult for community members to wash our hands without, or to continuously wash hands without running water. Nutrition, without running water, it's easier for community members to choose to purchase sugary bottled water as drinks. And also we need water for our agricultural and livestock purposes. And looking at more like deeper issues, lack of water infrastructure has prevented more housing development from occurring, and also prevented more economic development from occurring. So this map here shows one of the projects that's in construction now, which is the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project, which is being funded as part of the agreement through the Navajo, or between the Navajo Nation and the state of New Mexico for the San Juan River. And so the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project will divert water from the San Juan River to a pipeline system that will deliver water to communities on the New Mexico side of the reservation. And on the right side of the map is the part of the project called the Cutter Lateral Project that will deliver water to communities on the far eastern side of the reservation. And the very last community that will receive water as part of the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project is my home community of Torreon. So the infrastructure needs, yes, they've been looked at for several years, and our community leaders have been looking at or making sure we can find ways to make sure it's done correctly and as quickly as possible. One of the needs that we need surrounding this water gallop supply project is water connection lines. So how do we get these connection lines developed to so that they're actually so that the supply project actually delivers water to our homes? There's also issues or infrastructure issues surrounding electricity and lack of electricity. There are some homes that do not have refrigeration, so it makes it difficult for families to keep fresh produce and fresh food. There's health services are like far and in between our communities. And like I mentioned before, there's also poor connection issues in our community. But with regards to our lack of water infrastructure, it's at like the intersection of several other issues and crises that our communities on the Navajo Nation are facing, such as climate change and energy development. As I mentioned before, the Navajo Gallop Supply Project, the water is sourced from the San Juan River, and the San Juan River receives water from mountainous watersheds. And our mountainous watersheds are one of the most important sources of water for communities here in the Southwest, but they're also the most vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable sources of water. And because of that, it's important to look for ways to diversify our water sources. Or so one of the ways that we could diversify our water sources is to look at groundwater resources. However, with the large number of oil and gas development in the eastern part of the Navajo Nation, there's been a large depletion of groundwater resources in our area. So these are all like multiple crises that our communities are dealing with and that have been heightened by the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. I think I'm over time or out of town, but thank you for listening.
Thank you. So we are about, thank you, Lani, that was amazing. And we're at about 2 minutes before 1 p.m. So participants we have and presenters, we have a choice. This is scheduled to go until till 1 and end in another minute. So I'm just gonna ask like everyone on the chat, and then if there's like, if you can just like raise your hands if you think this needs, if you don't want the questions, I can just take a quick poll. There's like a little thing on the reactions at the bottom of your screen. If you put thumbs up, we'll do some more questions in that discussion, and if not, we'll wrap it up. So if you do the thumbs up, we can take questions, and if not, I'll wrap it up.
And while we're deciding that, let me go ahead and ask you, Lani, this one question you may be able to answer quickly that came up during the chat during your presentation. And thank you for that. That was wonderful. The question is, does the TCA, the Torreon, I'm sorry, I forget what it's an acronym for, but the TCA have the responsibilities of a CLUPC also, which I'm not sure what those are. And the question is, did the TCA take over those responsibilities?
No, the Community Land Use Planning Committee, which I think that's the CLUPC is the acronym for that. We're not officially a part of that, but I know Mario and Daniel, through their role as the council delegate and legislative assistant, they've been working with the chapter on the CLUPC efforts.
Great. And then following up, there's another question here, Lani, that says, have you seen any resistance on the Navajo Nation to developing water and other infrastructures because people feel it may lead to too intensive of development and they want to preserve a rural character?
Yeah, as far as I know, I haven't really seen or heard of any resistance. It's more of like a priority to get these infrastructure projects done. The Navajo Nation Council and the president, they actually were looking at using CARES Act funding to fund water infrastructure projects under reservation, but it's likely that not a lot or just very little of the funding will be used for water infrastructure.
I see. Now there's a question that's kind of related to that about, and I know you had mentioned some of the increase in internet activity and infrastructure that had been built, but there's a question about if there has been talk about providing other utilities to the Navajo Nation at the same time for efficiency's sake, coupling electricity and internet infrastructure with water infrastructure.
The Navajo Tribal Utilities Authority, they're the main, I guess, agency that handles the utilities on the reservation. And so they both handle like water and electricity. And so I'm not sure like what their involvement or plans have been for like, you know, trying to provide it jointly. So yeah, I'm not sure.
I see. Thank you for that. I guess we're having another question come in, and I suppose I'll keep taking questions until people leave and there's no one left and things like that. But
Actually, I'm gonna give it about 7 minutes for the questions, and then we'll wrap.
Great. Okay, cool. This question is, how is the census count intersecting with the pandemic in Navajo communities?
It's been greatly impacted. I think there was an article that came out like last week or a couple of weeks ago that said only 1% of the Navajo population has been counted as part of this year's census efforts. So it's been greatly impacted, but I know there's been there's more awareness campaigns that have been trying to get more people to fill out the census.
Great, thanks for that. We have a question for Rob too that came up in the talk a little bit earlier. And it was a question about how much of the failure to plan may be actually a failure to follow through with previous plans that previous administrations may have formulated, specifically in terms of the pandemic, but I think the question actually could be expanded a little bit in terms of its scope.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And certainly there are major parts of this that are a failure to carry through on plans that were made by earlier administrations. And what that means, though, is a failure of this administration to engage in that planning practice and to continue that planning practice in a meaningful way. That's been true on the primarily on the federal level. I think that we've had much better planning by and large at the state level. Now, no one expected the states to be able to deal directly with the pandemic crisis. That was thought of as a national crisis. A pandemic, by definition, is going to be a national problem, and it doesn't make any sense. As we've discovered in New Mexico, the pandemic does not stop at the Texas border or the Arizona border or the Mexican border. We've seen the consequences of having good rules and good laws and good planning in New Mexico when there's inadequate planning at jurisdictions next to us. So it seems like there really needs to be a federal approach to this. That hasn't happened with regard to the pandemic. That's put a lot of pressure on the state, which you say has done a better job, but really wasn't in a position to do everything it probably needed to do because it didn't expect that it would have to take up that obligation.
I see. Thanks, Rob. We also have one question for Sarita coming back. There was a question about in terms of trying to utilize private funding sources and unrestricted accesses through private sources, and what has been learned that could be used in the housing arena and in the need to build more housing quickly, emergency housing, transitional housing, things like this. Has the city learned anything in that particular realm related to private funding sources?
Sure. Well, I mean, first I'd say everything about the pandemic validated the housing first model of addressing people with homelessness and people who are precariously housed. Like it just showed over and over again, you get people in a place that's safe and then you can deal with the other issues that are making their lives difficult. But second of all, I think like Professor Schwartz sort of alluded to, we need a public health approach to housing, which means that we are wrapping around those services even when we're providing public housing. And so what that means for dollars is that in addition to the one-time capital dollars that we're pretty good at getting, whether that's from the feds or the state or local bonding, you need operational recurring dollars to make those services available throughout the lifespan of the housing. And that's the piece that we just haven't gotten right. And I think that question might have come from Jeff, who's a policy analyst downstairs. So I'm down to work on this together, Jeff. But you know, I think that's the key lesson is capital dollars without operating dollars is not going to solve the housing crisis.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarita. And thank you everyone for answering the questions. I just thought that all the talks were really great. Thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you for moderating the questions. I'm not sure why anyways, I'll try to wrap this up. I wanted to thank all of the participants. I don't think we usually give applause or standing ovation, but in this case, if there's a way we can do that virtually, it's an order, because not only have you donated your time so graciously and free of charge on a day-to-day basis, you are doing the actual work in the trench of addressing these issues. And I think we all need to be grateful that such qualified, intelligent, creative individuals and generous people are contributing to this. I don't think that we can go wrong in that case. The recent issue of Planning Magazine had a urbanist who commented as part of his reviewed book that a good party is where everybody brings more than enough. A bad party is where nobody brings enough. Localities are in the middle of a bad party. That's what we're experiencing, and that's one of the issues that we all are trying to address in planning and law and pretty much every aspect of our lives. So I'm gonna pass this to John Valdez, the APA president, to make some closing remarks. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel. I just want to echo what Rachel said. Thanks to our speakers. I think as planners, we're trying to figure out how to navigate this health crisis ourselves. And anytime we have the ability to get some input and some expertise from qualified speakers that will help us and how we engage in our communities, it's really a positive thing. So we want to thank you for giving your time. We really appreciate it. I also want to thank our members of our board, Rachel, Erin, James, Jessica, for putting this presentation together, for spearheading this initiative. Quite a bit of hard work and planning went into this to be able to help our members and provide content for our members in this time where we cannot meet in person. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for participating today in this presentation. And presentations like this is something that we as a chapter are trying to do for our members and even allied professionals as well, by taking advantage of Zoom webinar formats until we can meet again. But we do think that planners have a role to play in our community during this health crisis, and any discussion and strategizing is good. And we, like I said, we want to plan for some more of these presentations. So if you have any ideas, if you want to join us, if you want to put on a presentation yourself, please let us know. We'll be glad to accommodate you, and as we go out into the community and help our members try to get as much information as they can get. So thanks again for everybody today for doing this. This is great. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, that wraps it up. The link to the evaluation form will be on the website. And again, thank you so much, John, for making this possible. Bye, everyone.